Hello everyone, welcome back to another day and another session of AZ-103. We were on module 4th, which was all about Azure networking, and in the last class we completed lesson 1 of that. Now in this session we are going to cover lesson 2, which is about IP addressing and endpoints. Like I said before, if you have any questions, please make sure your questions are available within the comment section so that I can reply to them with the answers. So lesson 2 is all about IP addressing and endpoints. Let's see what do we have within this lesson. In this lesson, we are going to discuss what IP addressing is, what are public IP addresses and private IP addresses, then a demonstration on how to manage these IP addresses. Then we'll talk about service endpoints, how service endpoints can allow your Azure network to be accessible to a particular Azure service. This is actually really important, both in terms of exam and in terms of implementation. Then I'll show you how do you create a secure access to one of your storage account, and then a small demonstration on service endpoints. So let's first talk about what IP addressing is in Azure. Just like the normal IP addressing, Azure also uses the concept of IP addressing to provide communication between one Azure resource and another Azure resource. For example, if you want a virtual machine to interact with other virtual machine within a subnet, they will be doing it through the private IP address. But if you want a virtual machine to be accessible through internet, that virtual machine should have a public IP address, right? So the concepts of public and private IP address are the same, which you have already heard in your IT career. So the concept of private and public IP address are same in Azure as well. So private IP addresses are used within an Azure virtual network and your on-premises network, or when you use a VPN gateway or express route circuit to extend your network to Azure. In very simple terms, a private IP address is used whenever you want to work internally within your network. So if you're not touching internet, if you're not going outside of your network to the internet, then in all those scenarios, private IP addresses will be used. Public IP addresses is used for communication with internet, including Azure public facing services. Whenever you want to interact with the internet, that is where you need a public IP address. So within the internal communication, private IP address. If you want to talk to internet, public IP address. Now, IP addresses in Azure are independent resource, just like a VM, just like a storage account that we have discussed so far. So a virtual machine IP address is also an independent resource, and IP addresses are mapped to, in terms of virtual machine, they are mapped to network interface card. IP addresses can be mapped to a load balancer or an application gateway as well. So always remember that there are two kind of IP addresses in Azure, private and public, and IP addresses are independent resources, and these IP addresses can be mapped, or in other words can be associated with a network interface card, load balancer, or application gateway. Let's see a public IP address. A public IP address, like I said, is the IP address which can be associated with either a virtual machine through NIC. It can be associated with a load balancer, a VPN gateway as well. This is something I missed, a VPN gateway as well, and an application gateway as well. If you do not know about what load balancer, VPN gateway, application gateway as of now, that is fine because I haven't told you all these things yet. But you do know about virtual machine, and I've already told you that an IP address can be attached to, or you can say associated with, an NIC, and then the NIC can be attached to the virtual machine. Now similarly, it can be a public IP address can be given to a load balancer. We usually give it to a load balancer which is public facing. So the load balancer which is taking traffic directly from the internet, those load balancer has a public IP address. Then we have VPN gateway. If you do not know about VPN gateway as of now, that's fine. Just remember VPN gateway can also have a public IP address assigned to them, and application gateway as well. Right? What is this dynamic and static? Dynamic and static IP are two different kind of you can say these are two types of IP addresses which are available. So public IP address can be dynamic, it can be static. Similarly, private IP address can also be dynamic or static. If it is dynamic, it will be assigned by Azure. If it is static, it will be assigned by you. For example, let's suppose you have a subnet. Within the subnet, you are using the IP 10.0.0.4. The next available IP is 10.0.0.5, right? So if you are using dynamic allocation uh, of an IP address, it is basically allocated by Azure itself. So Azure internally uses its own DHCP setting, so it automatically allows you or automatically gives you an IP which is available next. So whatever the IP is available in the pool, the next available IP address, when it is automatically assigned by Azure to your VM or to your load balancer, that is known as dynamic IP address allocation. When you yourself, let's suppose you have a pool, and within the pool you have IPs ranging from 10.0.0.4 to 10.0.0.14. So instead of taking the next available IP, if you select your IP on your own without taking the help from Azure based dynamic IP address allocation, that is called static IP address allocation. So dynamic IP allocation happens when Azure itself provides you an IP address based upon which next available IP address is there, and static IP address is where you give yourself an IP address based upon your choice available in the whole IP address pool. Okay. But there are certain considerations in here. Only a virtual machine and load balancer can have a static IP address. VPN Gateway and Application Gateway will always have an IP address in case of public IP address defined by Azure. They will always have a dynamic IP address. Private IP addresses. Private IP addresses can be assigned only to three Azure resources: virtual machine, internal load balancer, and application gateway. It cannot be assigned to a VPN gateway. Why not? Because a VPN always talks to the internet. And in the next module, I'll show you why it is it so. When I'll show you connections between two different networks, there I will come to VPN gateway part. But always remember, VPN gateway uses public IP address. It cannot use private IP address because it has to travel through the internet. So it should have a public IP address. Wherein the case of private IP address can only be assigned to a virtual machine, an internal load balancer, or an application gateway. And yes, all three of them in terms of private IP address supports dynamic IP allocation as well as static IP allocation. So like I said, dynamic is the default way of IP address allocation in which Azure assigns the next available unassigned or unreserved IP address in the subnet's address range, and static is where you can select and assign any assigned or unreserved IP address in the subnet address range. Some of you might already know about it because that is the concept which we are studying from a long time in networking. This is not something new. Okay. All right, so let's see a demonstration where we will be managing IP address. We will be retrieving a static private IP address information, and then we'll be removing a static private IP address information. So first of all, let me go to my Azure portal, and in the last class I created a VM, so I haven't deleted it, right? But this time I'm going to create a network interface card. So either I will write NIC in here, and it will go to it will allow me to go to the network interface card, or I can simply jump into IP addresses, right? And you can see I am getting two options: public IP address, and it should also give you, okay, let me simply go to IP addresses this time, and then let me go to public IP addresses, right? So you can already see that I have a public IP address in here. I'll be going and click on add, right? This is how you will create a public IP address for yourself. Remember, when you create a VM, an IP address resource is automatically created. So you don't need to do that because creation of VM depends upon creation of IP address. But IP address in itself is an independent resource. So there are multiple things in here. Which version of IP you want? So usually if you're using IPv6, you can select that one, or IPv4, you can select that one, or if you want both, you can click on both. Right? If you use both, two IP addresses will be created, one with IPv4 and another one with IPv6. I'm keeping myself to IP version 4 here. Then there is SKU. SKU simply defines what can you do with an IP address, right? So if I talk about SKU defines a lot of things. For example, if you go with basic SKU, you will be given the option of dynamic and static assignment both. But if you go with standard one, you see this option is grayed out, right? That's the first difference between basic and standard. So SKU simply defines the choices that you will make, which will affect your IP assignment method, your security, available resources, and redundancy. For example, if you choose basic SKU, like I said, you will be given both the option, and in standard you won't be given both the option for IP address assignment. That's one difference. Security in basic is open by default. Security in standard is secure by default. So if you want more security, you should go with the standard SKU. Uh, If you choose basic SKU, you can attach this IP address to a network interface, VPN gateway, application gateway, and internet facing load balancer as well. All four of them you can assign it to. If you go with standard one, you cannot assign it to VPN gateway or application gateway, only to network interface card and load balancer. So these are the differences that you will also find onto Google. If you search what is the difference between basic SKU and standard SKU, you will find that difference as well, right? So few differences I have already told you. I'm going with basic, and I'm going to give this IP a name. So let's give it a name, which is test IP. Whether I want dynamic IP, if I want dynamic IP, Microsoft will automatically gives me a public IP address based on its own available pool. If I choose static, I will have a way to define my own IP address in here, right? So I will select dynamic IP address in here. Idle timeout minutes. This is how long your connection will be open. Since this is a public IP address, you have to provide a DNS name label for that as well. Then your subscription, your resource group, and your location. These are the things which will be there when you create a public IP address. Right. I already have a public IP address which I have already created for my VM in the last class. So if I click on this IP address, you can see that I have chosen the SKU basic for this, and the IP address was automatically assigned to me. It was dynamic in nature, so it was automatically assigned to me, right? But I can go to configuration and I can change this assignment even after creating the public IP address to static. That means this IP is something that I am reserving for myself. So it was given to me automatically by Azure, this public IP address. But if I make it static, it will be my IP address. This is something which is reserved for me, right? So that's one way to do this. That's one way to do it in terms of public IP address. In terms of private IP address, also private IP addresses are created when you create a virtual machine. And let me go to the virtual machine itself. If you go to your virtual machine, and if you go to the network interface card, which will be available to you within networking, this is my network interface card. I will click on this, and you will see my public IP address is already assigned to it. It is already associated with this network interface card because I'm accessing this virtual machine through internet by via RDPing to it, via connecting to it through remote desktop protocol. So a public IP address is already assigned to it, which I've just shown to you, and there is a private IP address which is also assigned to it. If I go to IP configurations again, you can see that my private IP address is dynamic in nature. So I can click on this, and then I can say change my private IP address into static one. Okay, so for private IP address, you won't see an independent resource just like public IP, but private IP is automatically assigned to a network interface card. So whenever you create a network interface card, a private IP address is assigned to that particular network interface card. And to choose the assignment from dynamic to static, this is something that you can do. Or at the time of the creation of the resource, when you're creating your VM or when you're creating your load balancer, then also you can choose whether you want a dynamic or a static private IP address. That is also possible, right? So that is how you will make changes to the IP addresses within your environment. In which scenario should you use dynamic IP address? Dynamic IP address tend to change, right? So if you, if you, uh, let's say if you want to create a DNS server on Azure, or if you want to create a domain controller on Azure, which has a very, you can say, uh, if you're running any service which is really important to you, right, in that kind of scenario, make sure you use static IP address. Do not use dynamic IP address over here, because dynamic IP address tend to change. And if you're not using any kind of special service, any kind of important services on Azure, maybe you can use dynamic IP address over there, right? Remember, if you are using public IP addresses, you will be charged for both dynamic as well as static IP address, but static IP address will be charged more, right? So that is one difference between dynamic and static IP address, where you should use it. If you are using SSL certificate which are linked to IP addresses, so if you're using IP based SSL certificate, in that kind of scenario also you have to use static public IP address, right? And like I said, if you are using some special services or special roles like domain controller and DNS server, then again you have to use static IP address. You cannot use dynamic. And yeah, that are scenarios in which you should use whether the public IP address, or sorry, whether the dynamic IP address or the static IP address. Make sure you use static IP addresses wherever possible. Otherwise, you can go ahead and use Azure-based dynamic IP address. Right, so this was all about IP addresses. The next thing in here is service endpoints. So what are service endpoints and how they are important to us? Okay, there are a lot of Azure services which are available inside our environment. We just discussed about Azure storage, right? Before this module, we were discussing about Azure storage. Like I said, Azure storage is a service, Azure networks is a service, Azure VM is a service, right? Why we are talking about service endpoints now? To understand that, I will be showing you a diagram. Okay, so here you go. Okay, let's suppose this is your storage account. We are going back to one of the Azure service which we have just discussed, so that it becomes clear to you how to work on it. So we have a storage account, let's say, right? Within the storage account, what do we have? We have containers within which we will have blobs. Okay. Similarly, we have tables, files, queue. Right? You already know about it because I have already covered this. Right? Now, let's suppose you have a VM which is situated in a virtual network within a subnet. Right? Just like this. So let's say this is your VM sitting within a subnet inside a virtual network. And just like this, there are, let's say, multiple virtual machines within this subnet. So that's your VM, and that's your subnet, and that's your VNet. Okay. Now, at this moment of time, I'm using my laptop, right? And I am on open internet, as you can see, right? I'm not a part of a network. I'm simply accessing everything through my laptop, which is available on open internet. And you have seen that I'm able to access my storage account, right? I have done this in the past as well. I am able to access my storage account. So basically, whatever traffic is flowing to my storage account, That is coming through where? That is coming from the open internet. Correct? Let me show you with a diagram as of with a portal as well. Let me quickly create a storage account for you to understand this. So let's go to storage accounts, which is one of the service, and click on add resource group. I'll select my created resource group, and the storage account name is, let's make it service endpoint storage account. Right? You can give any name that you want. Rest of the options I'll keep as it is. I won't make any change, and review and create. This is just for testing purpose that I'm creating this storage account. When you want to go ahead with the labs, with the demonstration that I'm doing, make sure you have the same environment which I am having currently, right? So if I deleted something from the previous class, you should also delete it. If I'm not deleting something from the previous class, you should keep it. For example, I didn't delete my VM, I just kept it in a stopped state so that it doesn't charge me more, right? And rest of all the things I deleted. Okay, so my storage account is getting created, and once it is created, what I will do is I will simply upload some file to a blog, and then I'll show you how I'm accessing it. Okay, so let's wait for a while. Meanwhile, I'll switch back to my paint in here. Right, so as soon as my storage account is created, you can see that I will connect to the blob through my laptop without any problem, and I will be able to access it. Right. Similarly, if you are doing it from your VNet, which is within a subnet, you can also access the blob just like I did, and your request will also travel through the public internet just like mine. Okay, so both of our requests is traveling through public internet, right? That means the request which is originating from my laptop or from your virtual machine, which is there within your virtual network on Azure, or within virtual network on within the subnet available on Azure, they're both traversing through the public internet. But we also know that Microsoft services, whether it's VM or storage account or whatever they are all part of Microsoft internal network backbone, right? They are all connected together through Microsoft internal backbone network. This is the network through which Microsoft, uh, I mean, if let's say if all your services are there within your own data centers, they will be able to communicate with each other, right? So you should have your own network which allows them to communicate with each other. So just like that, see, my laptop cannot have an internal Microsoft backbone network with the Microsoft Azure storage account. That is not possible because my laptop is available at my home. But Azure VM, which is running in Azure subnet, which is running within the Azure VNet, that is hosted somewhere in Azure data center. Similarly, the storage account is hosted somewhere in Azure data center. So Azure must have a way to communicate them through their internal network only. What is the need of going through the public internet? Right? So that's what we will see as of now, how we can check this. So my deployment is complete. I'll go to my storage account and I will simply go to blog, and then there I will click on container, test container, and public private doesn't matter. You can give any public access level in here, it doesn't matter. So let's say private, and then within the container I'm simply uploading a file just for test purpose. Okay, now you can see that I'm doing all these activities. I'm going to storage account and I'm doing all these activities without any problem, without any issues. So that means how I am accessing my storage account? I'm accessing my storage account through some public internet, right? Am I doing it through the public internet? Is my traffic going through the public internet? Yes, because I'm in my laptop, and through my laptop I'm opening a Azure portal, right? So all my traffic is going through the public internet, and then through the Azure portal I'm accessing a storage account. So when I'm uploading something or I'm downloading something, I'm going through a public network. My IP is public. Whatever traffic is going, it is going through the public internet. That's what I'm doing. If I show you with this diagram over here, this is what I'm doing in this diagram. I'm going through the public internet. Similarly, I have a virtual machine. So if I go in here and if I go back to a virtual machine, I've told you yesterday I have created a virtual machine. So this is my virtual machine, which is, if you go to the networking, which is there inside a virtual network and a subnet, right? So if I click on this virtual network, I am within virtual network with IP address range 192.168.0.0/16, and I have an IP address of 1.4. I have also logged into this virtual machine, right? And if I, this is my virtual machine within Azure Virtual Network and Subnet, and if I show you the IP address of this, it is also 192.168.1.4. Okay. Now from here, if I try to access the storage account, so I'll be going and first changing the enhance security configuration to off. This is required if you want to open portal.azure.com. So now what I'm doing, I'm going to the VM which is available in Azure based virtual network and Azure subnet, and from there I'm opening portal.azure.com and like and seven sorry, I'm going to access my Azure portal in here. Right, so now I'm accessing my Azure portal through my virtual machine, which is available within a virtual network and within a subnet. But right now, if I access my storage account, which I've just created, which is available in here inside storage accounts. So this was the account that I created, service endpoint storage account. If I click on this and if I go to blobs, which is here, okay, coming. So here it is the blob, and let's click on blob. And there you can see that I can access my container as well as my file which I have created. Right, in both the scenarios, whether I'm accessing this storage account through my personal laptop's browser or I'm doing it through a browser which is available within an Azure virtual machine, in both of the scenarios, I'm going through what? I'm going through I'm going through public internet. My requests are being transferred through public internet. So Microsoft says if you want to access any Azure services, and there is a list of those Azure services which you are accessing through public internet, but you no longer want them to access through public internet, you just want to access them from a specific subnet in a specific virtual network only within Microsoft internal backbone network, then you can use the concept of service endpoint. So Microsoft says that if you have a virtual network and a subnet on Azure, and from that specific subnet you want to connect to any Azure service like storage account, we can allow you a way to not to actually bypass the public internet, right, and come straight to that service or access that service straightly through our own internal backbone network, which is much more secure than going to public internet to access your resources. Microsoft says for that you need to create a service endpoint within your network which can talk to that service. So this virtual network and subnet that you have, here you have to create a service endpoint which can talk to the service, which is storage account, and that service endpoints will help you restricting access to your storage account from this particular subnet only, and its connection will be given to you by Microsoft Backbone internal network. Okay, let's see how do we do that. I'm going back to my Azure portal, and this is my virtual network. If I go down within my virtual network, there is a service endpoint defined in here. If I click on add, it says select your service. So these are all the services for which Azure provides you service endpoints. So that means you can connect to these services on Azure without the need of going to the public internet. Without routing your traffic to the public internet, you can straight away connect to these services through Azure Backbone network from a particular VNet or subnet from where you are initiating the service endpoint request. So in my case, it is what? It is a storage. So I will choose which service? Microsoft.storage, right? Policies, you can define any policies in here. No need to worry about that because policies are not part of this course. And then I will choose subnet, from which subnet I want to access this particular service. So I am within the VNet. Within the VNet, I only have one subnet. If I had multiple subnets, I would have chosen any subnet that I wanted from where I want access to this. So I will choose subnet 1 and I will say add. So now what I have created, if I go back to this diagram in here, from this virtual network, I have created a service endpoint, a secure service endpoint to my storage account, right? Since the service endpoint is created, now a connection has been established between this subnet and the storage account, and this connection will not pass through the public internet. It will pass through the Microsoft internal backbone network, right? So the endpoint is created, all the traffic will go from here. But what if I also want that only from this particular subnet I can access my storage account? That means since I have already created a service endpoint, the traffic to the storage account from this particular subnet will go through the Microsoft internal backbone network. But I'm still able to access my storage account through the public internet, right? Let's suppose a scenario in which you want to restrict access to your storage account from any kind of public internet traffic. That means nobody coming from the public internet should access your storage account. Only the virtual network and subnet that you have allowed should come and access your storage account, and that too through the MS internal backbone network. In that kind of scenario, if I go to my storage account as of now, and if I access my storage account through my laptop, I'm doing this through my laptop, and if I access blobs, you can see I'm still able to access it. Why? Because public internet is still not blocked to this storage account. The endpoint is created. That means when I go to that VM and I access this storage account, my traffic is going through the Microsoft internal backbone network, but I'm still able to access it through my laptop. That means public internet is also available, also not restricted as of now. So for that, what I will do, I will go to the storage account this time and I will click on firewalls and virtual network. When I go to firewalls and virtual network, it says my storage account is allowed access from all the networks, which I do not want as of now because the service endpoint is already created. So I will say selected networks only. Which network? Here I will give my virtual network settings. So I will say add existing virtual network. Virtual network, which is the name of my virtual network, my VNet 1. And which subnet I want? Subnet 1, which I have selected and created the endpoint for. So from this particular virtual network and subnet only, the people who are accessing my storage account will be able to connect. All other networks from where people are connecting it will not be allowed. Only from this specific virtual network and subnet, access to my storage account is required or allowed basically. There is also an address range you can give in here. If you have a custom address range which is not available in Azure VM or Azure Virtual Network, that is also something that you can provide in here. But that is something different. We'll focus on here and I will save the setting. So what I have done as of now, if I go back to my image in here, previously a service endpoint was created. When the service endpoint was created, all the requests from this subnet to this storage account was going through the Microsoft internal backbone network. It was not traveling through the public internet, right? It was blocked. But from other laptops or from other machines, still they can access the storage account through the public internet. Now once I have blocked the access through allow firewalls and virtual network, let's see what happens. I'm going to refresh my page now and I'm going to my storage account and I'm going to access my blobs now. I'll click on blobs and then I'll click on test and then see what message I'm getting. An authorization failure occurred. Recent changes to firewall and virtual network settings may not be in effect yet. If you have recently changed in setting, try to wait up a minute. This is the actual message. This request is not authorized to perform this operation. Why not? Because now I've said the access to the storage account is specifically restricted to the virtual network and subnet that I've mentioned within the allow firewalls and virtual network setting. So anywhere, if I give people access to my storage account, if they are even the global admin, if they are even the account admin, if they are accessing this from a public internet, they won't be able to do that because the access is restricted only through a particular virtual network and a particular subnet. That means if I go to my virtual machine in here, now I'm inside my virtual machine and then go to portal.azure.com and simply refresh this page, right? And go back to my storage account. Here, and then I'll click on the storage account that I have. Which is this one. And then I go to blobs. Right? Would I be able to access my blob? Yes, of course. Why? Because this VM that you are accessing, it's part of the virtual network and subnet, which you have explicitly allowed within this virtual, within this storage account. So if I go to blob and then if I click on test, I should be able to see that. Why? Because my request is originating from the virtual network and subnet, which is allowed in the storage account, right? So that is what service endpoint does. Service endpoint does create a connection from from a specific Azure virtual network and a subnet to one of your Azure services from the list of the services that I've shown to you. For example, in our case, it is storage account. What this service endpoint does is, see, if you do not have a service endpoint created, even if you are connecting to an Azure service from an Azure VM within a subnet, by default their request will go through the public internet. Even though storage account and Azure VM both are on Azure, but they will traverse to the storage account through the public internet. But when you explicitly says that we want a service endpoint, what will happen from this particular VNet and this particular subnet, if you initiate a service endpoint, it will create a connection to the Azure services which you want to access, a connection which will be based upon Microsoft internal backbone network. It will never go through the public internet. That's what service endpoint does. But if you want to further restrict access so that storage accounts, services like storage account is not accessible from any outside network, only available from this particular network and subnet only, or the virtual network or subnet that you allow, go to that particular resource, go to firewall or virtual network settings, and there explicitly define from which virtual network only you want the access. Okay, so two things to remember in here. All the Azure services are by default accessible through the public internet. Two Azure services communicating with each other, they always communicating by default on public internet. If you want a particular virtual network and subnet to communicate to one of the Azure services like storage account on Microsoft internal backbone network, use a service endpoint. If you want to further restrict that Azure service like storage account to not be accessible from any kind of public internet, only from a specific virtual network and subnet, go to the firewalls and virtual network setting of that storage account and explicitly mention the virtual network and subnet from where you want to have the access from. Okay, so what are the use case scenario for service endpoints? Let's suppose you are using, there are many services that you can use. Storage account is just one because you have just studied storage account, but you can use keyword for that. You can use SQL databases, Azure SQL databases as a particular service accessible from a particular virtual network and subnet. So there are 7 to 8 services which you can add as a service endpoint, right? But I have chosen storage account because you have studied storage account as of now. It will be easier for you to understand. So basically, the use case scenario for this will be, let's suppose you have an organization, right? You're working with an organization, and your organization has a restricted environment, and your organization wants, your organization are using storage accounts, SQLDB, etc. But they do not want it to be accessible from anywhere. For example, let's suppose I'm global admin, or sorry, I'm account admin for Azure, right? And I'm taking my laptop back with me at my home, and from my home I'm connecting through the through my own Wi-Fi, right? And I'm not using VPN, let's say. I'm not connecting to internal network. Or even if I'm using VPN, I would be able to download it to my local system, right? I can connect to the storage account and I can download the file to my local system. So that could be a breach. So when you apply this, when you say that only access a particular Azure service from a defined virtual network and a subnet, you are restricting the access to it. So only when the user will be connected to that virtual network, only then he will be able to access that service. This creates more security, more restrictions in terms of accessing your Azure services, which are confidential in nature. Okay, so this is service endpoints described to you. So once again, what are service endpoints? Endpoint limit network access to specific subnets and IP addresses. It improves security for your Azure service resources, just like I explained to you. It provides optimal routing for your Azure service traffic from your virtual network. Now, instead of going to the public internet, service endpoint restricts your traffic to go through the Microsoft Azure internal backbone network. Endpoint uses the Microsoft Azure backbone network, and it is simple to set up with less management overhead. You just have to click and then it will be done. These are all the services which provides service endpoints. That means storage, starting from the very end, storage, SQL, service bus. How do you secure access to the storage endpoints? If you want to configure a storage account to be accessible from a particular virtual network and subnet, first of all, that storage account should have service endpoints enabled. That's one thing. And secondly, the virtual network from where the virtual network from sorry the storage account from where you are accessing it, that storage account should have that virtual network and subnet enabled inside the firewalls and virtual network setting in Azure port, right? So I've already shown you how to create a storage account. I've shown you how to create a subnet service endpoint, how to secure the storage, and then the storage testing. So now from my public internet, if I go in here, you will see that I'm not able to access my storage account files, but from the VM which is available in that virtual network and subnet, I'm able to access my log without any errors. So this is it, guys. This is virtual network service. Sorry, this is service endpoints that we have. In the next lesson, we'll discuss Azure DNS. So if you have any questions with service endpoints or IP addressing, I'll leave that into comments and I will take them and answer them to you. Thank you all, guys, and I'll see you in the next class.